Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be doing an RTS control camera inside Godot. So let's go, we'll be starting with a blank project. The first thing I'm going to be doing is add a 3D scene, so we can add it as a world node. Now let's add here a mesh instance 3D, and let's add a plane. So I can see some sort of ground stuff. Let's put it in 20. And I want a little texture here, so let's go to... Now I want the geometry here on the material override. And let's change the albedo here to something that we like this. Next, let's add a building, which I made from Blender, which is this weird temple thing that I made just for prototype the camera here. Then let's add this unit so you can have a standard measure for our 3D scene. Now I want to add a camera so we can see stuff around. And let's add our setup camera actually. So add two node 3Ds. Name this one camera base, and this one camera socket. So add this socket to the base and the camera to the socket. So here's how the setup of the RTS camera will work. Let me just take this socket and increase its altitude by 7. There we go. So here's how the RTS camera will work. This guy right here, which is the camera base, will move on these both axes right here, and will rotate on this axis, on the y-axis. And after that, what we have is the camera socket, which is going to rotate just the x-axis, like so. So you can adjust the mouse rotation using the camera. Next, we are going to use the camera Z transform to work like a zoom operation, like so. So we have a full RTS camera from this setup. And the advantage of separating into two different nodes is because we have the separate transforms and it's easy to code. So let's first thing position the camera here so I can see what I'm doing. I'm gonna put -45 and let's save our scene. I still didn't save the scene. Now let's run our scene. Now, as you can see, everything is black and gray. That's because our scene has no environment or sun like the editor. It's just like this. So let's add the sun and environment by going here and add sun to the scene and add environment to the scene. Now we have these two nodes here, which were the previous sun and environments we saw in the editor. Now if you run our scenes by going here, and let's select the current scene. And there we go. Now we have a sun and some elements of the environments. Now the next step, which I want to do, is if you run our scene, you can see there's a lot of alias here. I'm going to add quickly just an anti-alias. Let's go to the project settings, anti-alias, and let's add 8. And as you can see, now we have smooth edges. Nice. So now let's start coding our camera. Let's select our camera base and attach a new script. And let's call this script RTS Camera. And let's create. Now for our code here, I like to use static typing. So let's change the code a little bit here. I'm going to remove those comments. And I'm going to start by transforming this into a static function, and we do this by typing here void. So what we're telling here is that there's nothing to be returned from this function. So we type in void, which is the same from the process, and delta here represents a float. So I'll be using static time throughout the tutorial. Next, we're going to add a new function, which is going to be the unhandled input event. And event here is a input event, and this function also returns nothing, so let's type void. Let's save it. Oh, I missed a pass here. So that's our first three my functions. Next, let's add our nodes here, which we'll be using throughout the code, which, let me just type here, comment nodes, which are just the camera base and the socket, really. So let's add here the camera socket. So let's call it camera socket. And let's add a node 3D. And we get here the camera socket. We also are going to add the camera. So already our camera. Let's call it, yeah, just camera. Camera 3D. And let's add here camera 3D. There we go. Now we have some nodes here to work with. So the first thing we'll be doing is the camera movement rule, the keys WASD. So for that, I want to use a variable to control the speed of the movement. And I'm going to be using export range here. And I'll show you what it does in a minute. So the range is going to start at 0. It's going to go through 100. And it's going to be stepped with ones. And the variable is going to be named camera move speed. And it's going to be a float. And let's add here 20 as the default value. So why we are using export range here? Well, simply put, if we click on the camera base, you can see it now shows here camera move speed as a variable we can change. And this is a great thing for us because now we can set some different values through the editor without having to access the script panel. So this is a great way to create an interface for scripts. So let's create a function to move our camera. So let's go down here and let's declare a new function, camera base move. And it's going to have as an input the delta. So we're going to use this inside the process function. So delta is a float and this function does not return anything, so void. The first thing we want is to ask if this camera can move. So let's create a new variable here. And I'm going to be asking this as, marking this as flags. So let's say camera var camera can move base. And this is going to be a boolean, which is true at the moment. Now down here, we can ask if camera can move base. Rather, we can do if camera cannot move base, then return. So this is going to skip the function if we, for some reason, decided to disable the movement of the camera. So the first thing we want is to get the direction of the movement. Var velocity direction, which is going to be a vector 3, and it's going to start as vector 0. Next, we want to check the input given to see if it's pressed the W, the A, etc. But before we start typing that, let's define it first. So let's go to project settings, input map, and let's add here some actions. It's going to be camera forward, camera backward, camera right, and camera left. And for the camera forward, we want to press W here. For camera backward, the S. Camera right is going to be D, and camera left, A. Alright, now you can check for those actions if the input is being pressed. And any of these given inputs will say that action is pressed. So you can also give multiple inputs, which is not the case at the moment. So let's go here and ask if input is action pressed. And here we're going to ask if it is the forward action. Then we're going to do something. So let's duplicate, but let me just finish typing here, velocity direction. We're going to change the velocity direction. And let's copy this 4 times. And here we're going to change camera backwards, camera right, and camera left. Now here on the code, we want to add here subtractive transform dot basis dot z. Here we want to add the transform basis, and here it's going to be the x. So we want to add transform basis x, and here the same thing, transform basis x. So what this does, well, simply put, this is going to define a direction for us, and I'm going to show you how this works. So let's print these values down here. So let us do print camera, well, no, it was velocity direction. There we go. So we are just printing the velocity at the moment. Now let's run this function on our process. So camera move, adding delta, and let's add a new flag here, where camera can process. So we can control if you wish to deactivate the camera. And now we can do here the same thing. If we cannot control, if the camera cannot process, we are going to return. And this allows for more control for us. So this should print for us right here. So we run the scene. And as you can see, it's printing 0. If you press W, it's going to print the correct values down here. Now we are going to use that velocity direction as our position changer. So let's go here and add position is equal to plus velocity direction normalized. So we're normalizing the direction. And let's type in here multiplied by delta. And we're going to multiply it by our velocity, our speed movements, which is camera move speed. And let's see how this behaves by pressing F6, and let's see if that works. And as you can see, our camera already can move using the WASD keys, which we added on the input map. Now let's add the zoom functionality. For that, let us go to the project settings and add here camera zoom in, which is going to control the camera zoom inputs, and camera zoom out, which is the reverse. So on this case, camera zoom in, I want the mouse wheel up, but also the plus on the keypad. And for the camera zoom out, I want the mouse wheel down and the minus on the keypad. So we have now these actions to be added here. Now let's add some variables which we will be using on the zoom functionality. So let's go up here, and I'm going to say camera zoom, and here let's add a commentary here, camera move. And here let's add a variable which will be controlling the direction of the zoom. So let's add here the camera zoom direction. So it's going to tell if our camera needs to move forwards or backwards. And we will be using a negative or positive float. And also we're going to need a export range here. And I want it to start at 0 and end at 100 and be stepped with 1. And this export range is going to be named camera zoom speed, and by default I'm going to give it 40. Load the autocomplete. Next, let's add a new export range, which starts at 0 and ends at 100, step it at 1 also, and it's going to be called camera zoom min. This is going to define the minimum zoom level. which I want it to be 10. And next, let's add a maximum zoom. So export range start at 0 and then 100, be stepped by 1. Our camera zoom out, which is going to be by default. Let's give 25. We have to test this to see if this is appropriate at any time we can do so. Let's add a new variable, which is going to start at 0 and at 2. Have a step value of 0.1, and this is going to be called the camera zoom speed dampener. So let's just call damp. So here, what is going to do, it's going to reduce the amount of the zoom. So let's do 0.92. So it's going to reduce the direction by this dampener. So now we have the variables which we'll use on our zoom functionality. Let's create now our function which will be zooming. So our zoom functionality is going to work like so. Let's add the name camera zoom updates. Let's give it a delta, which is going to be a float, an argument. This function does return nothing, so let's add void. Let's add a description for this function, so later we can know what it does. Controls the zoom of the camera. This guy here, let's give a description. Moves the base of the camera with WSD. Alright. For our camera zoom update, let us start by checking if we can actually zoom in or out. Just like the camera move, here we've done it. So let's create a new variable and camera can zoom. And let's give it a bool. And right here I can do if we can zoom, then return it, which is going to skip the function if for some reason we don't want it. Now let's add the new zoom, which is going to be updated. So if you remember, we want the zoom operation to work. Want the zoom operation to work by manipulating the z coordinates, like so. So we are going to achieve this by going here and adding a new variable, var new zoom, which is going to be a float. And here are some things that we want. We want the current camera position, so camera position.z plus, and the new zoom is going to change that position by the camera zoom speed, which camera zoom speed right here, which is going to be then multiplied by delta. I'm going to leave delta as the last parameter here. I think it's best to do so. And so back here on the zoom, let's add the camera zoom direction, and let's now clamp this zoom value. So this by itself works, but now let's use the min and max zoom levels. So I'm going to do that later so you can see it step by step. So let's do here camera position z is equal new zoom. So we are adding that position. You can pretty much test this, and we're also going to say that the camera zoom direction, let's test this to see what happens. So the camera zoom update needs to be called now, which you're going to be adding here. Camera zoom update delta. Now there's no function to activate this, which is going to work automatically. So let's go here to the non-handled input and adding some controls to call this function here. And here on the non-handled input, let's add a new category, which is going to be our camera zoom controls. And here, let's first check for our action events. So if this event is action, and here we're going to say camera zoom in, and we're going to say that the camera zoom direction is equal to -1. So this is going to move the camera forwards when we zoom in, which is what we want. Otherwise, if the event is our camera move out, zoom out, then we want to reverse that. So camera zoom direction equals 1. So we are reversing that. So this right here should activate the code for the camera zoom update, which is called on process right here. And it's going to ask you first if the camera can zoom, and if it can zoom, it's going to change the positions here. Now let's test this. And as you can see, if I zoom in or out, it's going to do so.